There are footballers who are born with extraordinary ability. And then there are footballers whose careers force us to reconsider what that ability actually means. Ousmane Dembélé has always belonged to the second group. The first thing people noticed was the speed. Then came the dribbling. Then the strange freedom with which he could use either foot, attack from either side, change direction without warning, and make defenders hesitate before they even knew what decision they were trying to make. But talent creates a difficult question. What happens when a player who has always depended on instinct has to learn how to live with expectation? For years, Dembele's career seemed to move between two extremes. At one end was the football everyone imagined he could play. At the other was the football he was actually able to play when his body, his confidence, his surroundings, and his responsibilities all aligned. He went from a quiet beginning in Vernon, in Normandy, to Rennes. From Rennes to Borussia Dortmund. From Dortmund to Barcelona, where the expectations were enormous and injuries repeatedly interrupted his progress, he became a world champion with France. Then he moved to Paris Saint-Germain, where the challenge was different again. At PSG, he was no longer simply the spectacular young winger everyone wanted to see. He had to become a complete attacking player, a player who could press, a player who could create, a player who could score, a player who could make decisions for the team rather than simply moments for himself. And then, in 2025, the argument changed. Dembele won the Ballon d'Or. The player who had spent years being described through potential was suddenly being judged through achievement. The question was no longer whether he could become one of the world's best. He had reached the summit. But the most interesting part of his story is not the trophy. It is the distance between the boy in Vernon and the player standing beneath the lights in Paris. Because the road was not straight. It was full of acceleration and interruption, of brilliance and doubt, of injuries, criticism, adaptation, and reinvention. And perhaps that is why Dembele's story matters. Not because he was always the best, but because he had to learn how to become the player everyone once believed he could be. Ousmane Dembele was born in Vernon, in Normandy, in May 1997. Vernon is not the kind of place most people associate with the beginning of a global football superstar. It is a town on the Seine, away from the enormous football stages of Paris, Marseille, or Lyon. There was no obvious guarantee that a child growing up there would one day play in the biggest stadiums in Europe. Football, at that stage, was simply football. A ball, a pitch, a game. And for a young Dembele, the attraction was not complicated. He wanted to play. What made him unusual was the way he played. He was comfortable with both feet. That sounds like a technical detail, but it can change the entire geometry of a football pitch. A defender usually wants to know which direction an attacker prefers. If the attacker has a dominant foot, the defender can try to show him toward the weaker side. Dembele made that calculation much harder. He could receive on one foot and leave on the other. He could cut inside. He could go outside. He could change direction. And because his decisions were often made instinctively, defenders had less time to prepare for them. The talent was obvious. But talent alone does not explain a career. At some point, a young footballer has to leave the world where ability is admired and enter the world where ability is tested. For Dembele, that transition eventually led toward Rennes. The environment became more serious. The pitches became more organized. The opposition became stronger. The training became more demanding. And the teenager had to discover whether the qualities that made him exciting in youth football could survive inside professional football. That is a different test. A youth defender may be surprised by a trick. A professional defender has seen tricks before. A professional opponent understands positioning. He understands physical contact. He understands how to close space. He understands how quickly a promising young player can become dangerous. So Dembele had to learn how to turn instinct into repeatable performance. At Rennes, the transformation accelerated. The club became the first major professional stage of his career. He moved through the development system and began to attract attention because the raw ingredients were impossible to ignore. The acceleration was real. The dribbling was real. The two-footed ability was real. But there was something else beginning to emerge. Personality. Dembele did not play as if he had been given a list of instructions about what was allowed. He played as if the pitch contained possibilities. A defender in front of him was not simply an obstacle. It was a problem to solve. A narrow gap was not simply a closed space. It was an invitation to find another route. That freedom became one of his defining characteristics. And it also became part of the challenge that would follow him for years. Because elite football rewards freedom, but it also demands discipline. A winger cannot dribble every time. A forward cannot attack every ball. A player cannot always choose the spectacular option. The highest level requires knowing when to accelerate and when to wait, when to risk and when to simplify, when to attack the defender and when to move the ball. Dembele's early career was about discovering that balance. In the 2015-16 season, Rennes gave him the opportunity to do it in senior football. The step was enormous. He was no longer a youth player trying to prove that he belonged. He was competing against professionals. And very quickly, he began producing moments that made people look twice. His first Ligue 1 goal came against Bordeaux. Then came a performance that made his name much harder to ignore. Against Nantes in April 2016, Dembele scored a hat-trick. 3 goals in a major professional match. The numbers mattered, but the manner mattered too. He looked fearless. He could run at defenders. He could attack space. He could finish. He could create. And suddenly the conversation around him changed. He was no longer simply an interesting young player from Normandy. He was a teenager capable of deciding professional matches. That distinction is important. Potential gets attention. Production changes expectations. And by the end of that breakthrough season, European clubs were paying attention. The next decision would define the speed of his rise. Dortmund was calling. Borussia Dortmund had become one of Europe's most respected environments for young talent. It was a club with a huge stadium, an enormous support base, and Champions League ambitions. But it was also a club where young players could be given responsibility. For Dembele, the move to Germany was more than a transfer. It was an education. He was leaving France. He was entering a new football culture, a new language, a new dressing room, a new level of pressure. And he was doing it while still a teenager. Dortmund did not need to wait years to discover what he could do. He was thrown into senior football immediately. The scale changed. At Rennes, the possibility had been becoming visible. At Dortmund, the possibility became international. The stadiums were bigger. The opponents were stronger. The matches were watched by millions. And the Champions League offered another level of exposure. A young winger can look extraordinary in a domestic league. But European football is unforgiving. Space disappears faster. Defenders recover quicker. The smallest mistake can become a counterattack. The ball travels faster. The decisions have to happen earlier. Dembele responded. His first season in Dortmund became one of the most spectacular breakthrough campaigns in European football. He scored. He assisted. He created. He played in the Champions League. And he helped Dortmund win the German Cup. The teenager from Vernon had moved from a modest beginning in Normandy to the center of one of Europe's great football environments. But the important development was not simply the highlights. It was the education. Dembele was learning how to play against better defenders. He was learning how to handle greater tactical demands. He was learning how to survive when opponents already knew that he was dangerous. And he was learning something else. Football at the highest level is not only about what you can do. It is about how often you can do it. The world had now seen the talent. The next question was whether the talent could survive the weight of expectation. Barcelona answered that question with one of the biggest transfers in football history. In August 2017, Dembele became a Barcelona player. He was 20 years old, and suddenly, the scale of his career changed again. Barcelona was not simply another major club. It was a club with a particular identity. A club associated with possession, technical quality, and attacking football. A club whose history included some of the greatest players the game had ever seen. And Dembele was arriving after Barcelona had just lost Neymar. The comparison was almost impossible to avoid. He was not being asked simply to become Ousmane Dembele. He was arriving in an environment where people were looking for the next great attacking star. That is one of the hardest situations for a young footballer. The world sees your price before it sees your personality. It sees the transfer before it sees the player. And almost immediately, Dembele's Barcelona story became a story of two forces: expectation and interruption. The talent remained, but injuries began to shape the narrative. His first season was severely disrupted after he suffered a hamstring injury early in the campaign. For a young player arriving at a new club, an injury is more than a physical problem. It interrupts adaptation. It interrupts rhythm. It interrupts relationships with teammates. It changes the training process. And when the player carries a huge transfer fee, the absence becomes part of the public conversation. Dembele returned. Then came other injuries. More recovery. More rehabilitation. More attempts to rebuild momentum. The cycle became frustrating. Because the footballer everyone had seen at Rennes and Dortmund was still there, but he could not always stay on the pitch long enough to show it consistently. This is where football careers become difficult to understand from the outside. A highlight reel shows the player running past defenders. It does not show the weeks of rehabilitation. It does not show the empty training room. It does not show the controlled return to running. It does not show the uncertainty of wondering whether the body will cooperate again. And it certainly does not show how difficult it is for a young player to remain confident while the public begins to question whether the promise will ever become reality. Barcelona still produced moments of brilliance. Dembele could still decide matches. He could score. He could assist. He could create goals from situations that appeared closed. And as his time at Barcelona continued, he became more experienced. But the injuries never completely disappeared from the story. This created a strange contradiction. The player could be brilliant enough to remind everyone why Barcelona had signed him, and then unavailable enough to remind everyone why the journey remained incomplete. The pressure grew. So did the criticism. Some of it was about performances. Some was about consistency. Some was about injuries. Some was simply the consequence of being an expensive young player at one of the world's most famous clubs. But beneath the noise, Dembele continued developing. His football intelligence grew. His movement improved. His ability to operate in different attacking positions became more useful. And he began to understand that elite football would not always be about the spectacular moment. Sometimes the most important decision was the simple one: a pass instead of a dribble, a run without the ball, a defensive sprint, a movement that created space for someone else. Those details would later become central to his reinvention. But before that reinvention became visible, there was another part of his career that shaped him: France. Dembele had represented France at youth level before becoming a senior international. His senior debut came in 2016. And just as his club career accelerated, his international career brought another kind of expectation. France is not an ordinary football nation. It has a deep history. It has produced generations of elite players. And by the late 2010s, the national team was building one of the strongest squads in world football. Dembele became part of that group. He was still young, still developing, still trying to establish himself at Barcelona. But international football compresses time. A club season gives a player months to correct mistakes. A major tournament may give you only a handful of matches. Every performance matters. Every mistake is remembered. And every victory becomes part of national history. In 2018, Dembele was part of the France squad that won the World Cup in Russia. He did not become the central star of that tournament. That distinction matters. The title was a collective achievement. France had an extraordinary squad, and Dembele was one part of it. But the experience still mattered. He was a world champion before the age of 21. That is an extraordinary line on a career, yet it did not solve the larger question. What kind of player would Dembele eventually become? Because winning a World Cup does not automatically turn a young player into a complete footballer. It gives experience. It gives belief. It gives perspective. But development continues. The years after the World Cup were complicated. At Barcelona, injuries and inconsistency continued to interrupt his progress. For France, competition for attacking places was intense, and Dembele's career seemed to be waiting for a moment when his ability and his body could finally remain aligned. That moment did not arrive immediately. He had to keep going. At the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, Dembele was part of another France team that reached the final. This time, the ending was different. France lost to Argentina on penalties after an extraordinary final. Dembele had been involved in the match, but he was substituted before the end of the first half. For a player who had already experienced World Cup triumph, the defeat was another lesson. Football can give you the highest achievement and then, 4 years later, leave you standing on the wrong side of history. The important thing is what happens next. Dembele returned to club football, and eventually, the next great change in his career arrived: Paris Saint-Germain. In 2023, Dembele returned to France, joining PSG. At first glance, it looked like a familiar story. Another major club, another enormous stage, another environment with huge expectations. But this time, the football itself was different. Dembele was older, more experienced, more aware of what his body required. And PSG had a coach, Luis Enrique, who demanded more than individual brilliance. The new challenge was not simply to give Dembele the ball and ask him to dribble. It was to integrate his abilities into a system. That meant pressing. It meant movement. It meant combination play. It meant understanding when to stay wide and when to move inside. It meant creating for teammates. It meant contributing when he did not have the ball. And gradually, something changed. The player who had once been defined primarily by what he could do with the ball began to be defined by what he could make happen for the entire attack. This is one of the quietest transformations in elite football. A player does not suddenly become complete because of one spectacular goal. He becomes complete through thousands of decisions. Where to stand, when to run, when to press, when to pass, when to attack, when to wait, when to shoot, when to create. Dembele was beginning to understand the game differently. The speed was still there. The dribbling was still there. The two-footed ability was still there. But the chaos became more controlled, and that control became extremely important during the 2024-25 season. PSG entered the campaign with enormous ambition. The club wanted the Champions League, and Dembele increasingly became one of the central figures in the attack. His role was not limited to one position. He could start from the wing. He could move inside. He could combine. He could create. He could finish. He could press from the front. The player was becoming harder to categorize, and that was a sign of maturity. Young wingers are often judged by how many defenders they can beat. Elite attacking players are judged by how many problems they can create for the opposition. Dembele had moved from the first category toward the second, and then came the Ballon d'Or. The award has a strange power in football. It compresses a year of performances into a single judgment. For months, players accumulate goals, assists, trophies, important matches, and defining moments. Then, one evening, the football world turns one player into a winner. In 2025, that player was Ousmane Dembélé. For someone who had spent much of his career being discussed through what he might become, the moment was symbolic. The Ballon d'Or did not erase the difficult years. It did not erase the injuries. It did not erase the criticism. It did not change what happened at Barcelona. Instead, it placed the difficult years inside a larger story. The boy from Vernon had become the best player in the world according to the most prestigious individual award in the game. And perhaps the most powerful part of the moment was not the trophy itself. It was the reversal of the narrative. For years, people had looked at Dembele and asked whether he could stay fit, whether he could become consistent, whether he could fulfill his potential, whether he could become the player his talent suggested. Now the question had changed. He had already done it. The Ballon d'Or was recognition, but it was also responsibility. Because once you reach the top, the past stops being the only standard. The future becomes the standard. The next season begins. The next match begins. The next Champions League campaign begins. And suddenly, the player who spent years trying to prove himself has to defend his place at the summit. That is one of the strangest transitions in elite sport. Before you win, the question is whether you can. After you win, the question is whether you can do it again. Dembele's story, therefore, cannot end with the Ballon d'Or. The award is a climax, but it is not necessarily the conclusion. The 2025-26 season brought a new reality. Dembele entered matches as the reigning Ballon d'Or winner. Every stadium knew his name. Every opponent understood his importance. And PSG were no longer simply chasing history. They were trying to defend it. The pressure became different. When you are a young player, a quiet performance can be explained. You are still developing. You are still learning. When you are the Ballon d'Or winner, the same performance can become a question. Is he still the best? Can he maintain the level? Was the previous season a peak or the beginning of something even greater? That is the burden of recognition. Dembele's answer has been to keep evolving. He remains capable of the explosive dribble. He remains dangerous with both feet, but his value is now broader. He can influence a match without constantly touching the ball. He can create space. He can press. He can combine. He can attack from different positions. He can make a defense move simply because of where he stands. And that may be the strongest evidence of his development. The player has become less dependent on the spectacular moment. The spectacular moment is still available, but it is no longer the entire argument. There is also intelligence, timing, positioning, patience, responsibility. That is what separates a gifted footballer from a mature one. And it is why Dembele's career is more interesting than a simple list of clubs and trophies. Look at the journey from a distance. Vernon, Rennes, Dortmund, Barcelona, France, Paris. Each stage added something. Vernon gave him the beginning. Rennes gave him the first professional opportunity. Dortmund gave him European exposure and the freedom to develop on a major stage. Barcelona gave him pressure. It showed him how difficult it is to remain available and consistent when the world expects greatness. France gave him the experience of winning a World Cup and the pain of losing another final. Paris gave him reinvention. It gave him a tactical environment in which his raw qualities could become more complete. And then came the Champions League. Then the Ballon d'Or. The path now looks obvious, but it was not obvious while he was living it. That is one of the illusions created by hindsight. Once a player reaches the summit, the earlier stages can look like steps designed to reach it. They were not. They were uncertain. Every injury could have changed the story. Every difficult season could have changed the confidence. Every transfer could have gone differently. Every decision mattered. That is why the central question is not whether Dembele was always destined to become the best player in the world. There is no way to prove that. The more honest question is, how did a player with extraordinary natural ability become capable of sustaining it at the highest level? The answer is not one thing. It was time, experience, tactical education, physical maturity, failure, recovery, coaching, teammates, pressure, and, above all, adaptation. Dembele had to adapt repeatedly, from youth football to professional football, from France to Germany, from Dortmund to Barcelona, from Barcelona to PSG, from being a winger who could produce moments to becoming an attacker who could influence systems. That last transition may be the most important, because the modern elite game demands more from attacking players than ever. They have to defend. They have to press. They have to understand space. They have to make decisions quickly. They have to survive physically. They have to communicate. And they have to do it while being watched by millions. Dembele's evolution at PSG shows that he learned how to operate inside that complexity. The boy who once played almost entirely through instinct became a player who could combine instinct with structure. And when those two qualities meet, something powerful happens. The freedom remains, but it has direction. The risk remains, but it has purpose. The speed remains, but it is controlled. That is the player people are watching now. And yet there is another part of the story that should not be forgotten. The title says, from a boy in Vernon to the best player in the world. But becoming the best player in the world does not mean the journey suddenly becomes simple. There is always another match, another injury to avoid, another opponent, another tournament, another expectation, another generation of players. And football is especially unforgiving to anyone who believes the story is finished. Records change. Awards change hands. Teams change. Coaches leave. Young players arrive. The game keeps moving. Dembele knows that better than most. His career has already shown how quickly football can change. A brilliant season can be followed by an injury. A transfer can create hope and pressure at the same time. A major tournament can end in victory or disappointment. A player can be questioned for years and then, suddenly, be celebrated as the best in the world. The lesson is that football careers are not straight lines. They are collections of moments. Some are visible. Most are not. The public sees the goals, the trophies, the celebrations, the Ballon d'Or. But underneath those images are thousands of hours that never become part of the story. Training, recovery, travel, preparation, repetition. The ordinary work required to make extraordinary football look natural. That is the part of Dembele's journey that deserves attention. Because the most impressive thing about his career may not be that he could dribble past defenders at 17. It may be that, after years of interruptions and questions, he learned how to build a game that did not depend on one trick. He learned how to become useful in more ways, and that made him harder to stop. There is a temptation, when discussing the best players in the world, to imagine that greatness is something permanent, a fixed quality. A player is either born with it or he is not. Dembele's career offers a more complicated picture. Natural ability matters. Without it, none of this begins. But ability needs structure. It needs health. It needs experience. It needs opportunity. And sometimes, it needs failure. Failure is uncomfortable to include in a success story, but without it, the story becomes dishonest. Dembele's career contains failure. It contains injuries. It contains periods when expectations were higher than performances. It contains moments when his body stopped him. It contains matches that did not go his way. It contains criticism. And those things are not footnotes. They are part of the development. They forced him to adapt. They forced him to become more complete. They forced him to discover that talent alone could not carry him through every stage. That is why the final image of this story should not be a trophy. It should be a football. Because before the stadiums, before the transfers, before the contracts, before the Ballon d'Or, There was the same simple object, a ball on grass, a boy trying to control it, a player trying to understand it, and eventually, a footballer capable of controlling games at the highest level. The distance between those images is enormous, but the object is the same. That may be the simplest way to understand Ousmane Dembélé. Not as the transfer fee, not as the injuries, not as the criticism, not even as the Ballon d'Or winner. Those are chapters. The deeper story is adaptation. A boy with unusual natural ability entered professional football. Then football became more demanding, so he became more demanding of himself. The opponents improved. He improved. The stages became larger. He adapted. The expectations became heavier. He learned to carry them. The injuries interrupted him. He learned to return. The game changed. He changed with it. And eventually, the player who had once been described mainly through potential became the player everyone else had to prepare for. That is a remarkable transformation. But perhaps the most human part of the story is that somewhere underneath the awards and the stadiums, the original attraction remains. The joy of running with a football. The freedom of seeing a defender in front of you. The possibility that something unexpected might happen. That instinct is still there. It simply has more experience around it now. And that is what makes the journey from Vernon so compelling. The boy did not disappear. He grew. The instinct did not disappear. It became more controlled. The speed did not disappear. It became more useful. The dribbling did not disappear. It became part of a larger game. And the uncertainty did not disappear completely either, because every great player eventually faces the same question. What comes next? For Dembele, that question is now asked from the top of the mountain. He has won the World Cup. He has won the Champions League. He has won the Ballon d'Or. He has played for some of the biggest clubs in Europe. He has experienced extraordinary success. But the game does not stop. The next match still begins at 0. The next season still has to be played. The next generation is already coming. And perhaps that is the right place to leave him. Not as a finished footballer, not as a career reduced to a trophy list, but as a player still moving, still adapting, still carrying the lessons of every place he has been. Vernon, Rennes, Dortmund, Barcelona, France, Paris. Each place left something behind, and each one helped create the player who eventually stood on the world's biggest individual stage. At the beginning, he was a boy with talent. Then he became a prospect, then a professional, then a star, then a world champion, then a Champions League winner, and finally, a Ballon d'Or winner. The labels changed. The football remained. One day, the stadium will empty. The cameras will leave. The floodlights will become quieter. The trophies will become historical objects. The headlines will disappear. And the enormous words used to describe a career will become part of football's archive. What will remain is something much simpler. A ball, a pitch, a player, and the ability to make something happen. For Ousmane Dembélé, that ability began long before the world knew his name. It began in Vernon, and perhaps that is where the story should return. Not to the Ballon d'Or stage, not to the Champions League final, not to the biggest stadium in Europe, but to the quiet beginning. Because the greatest distance in this story is not the distance from France to Germany, or Germany to Spain, or Spain back to France. It is the distance between potential and proof, between what people think a player can become and what he eventually proves he can be. Ousmane Dembélé spent years traveling that distance. And in 2025, he reached a place that once seemed like a question rather than a destination. The boy from Vernon had become the world's best player. But the final lesson is not that talent guarantees greatness. It does not. The lesson is that talent can be transformed. It can be interrupted. It can be tested. It can be rebuilt. And with enough time, enough adaptation, and enough persistence, it can become something more complete than the talent that first attracted attention. That is the story of Ousmane Dembélé. A story that began with instinct. A story shaped by uncertainty. A story interrupted by injury. A story rebuilt through experience. And a story that, for now, reaches its highest point beneath the lights of Paris. But football has never been very good at endings. There is always another season, another match, another road. And somewhere beneath all the noise, the story is still about the same thing. A boy, a ball, and the freedom to see what might happen next.